much. Good evening. I hope everyone can hear me all right. So I wanted to talk to you this evening about this project which has been going on actually for probably more than 10 years in total, but I've kind of brought it more recently into the vet school and gotten a lot of our students involved in it over the last couple of years, which has been really nice. So this project is something which has grown out of work that I've been doing, working with the UK government and also working with facilities internationally, trying to look at different ways that we can assess and improve captive elephant welfare. So you'll be familiar, many of you, with these Asian elephants. There are now, it's estimated, less than 50,000 of them left in the wild. So they are classified as an endangered species. And when we use that term, we mean that there's a very high risk that they're going to go extinct in the wild. That means they're dying out. They are no longer going to be present on the planet. And here's our African elephants. And while numbers of African elephants are higher, they tend to be almost an order of magnitude higher, there's been a rapid decline of our African elephants as well. So we've lost 30% of them just in the last 7 years. And there are estimated to be approximately just over 350,000 left in the wild. So they now, since last year, are also classified as an endangered species. They are going extinct in the wild. Why is this happening? Well, a lot of it is down to us, all of our different activities. So we've been clear-cutting the land for various uses. A lot of that is to grow food for cattle and to have, in Southeast Asia, oil palm plantations. And another thing which is really causing a precipitous decline in elephants is that there's a lot of poaching of elephants for ivory. And that seems to have been really massively increased in the last decade in particular, so that now we have about 30,000 of them killed each year as a result of poaching. So this quote, I think, is a really apt one to kind of sum things up. So the Duke of Cambridge said, when I was born, there were 1 million elephants roaming Africa. By the time my daughter Charlotte was born, the numbers of savanna elephants had crashed to just 350,000. And at the current pace of illegal poaching, when Charlotte turns 25, the African elephant will be gone from the wild. So they are disappearing off the planet. And in particular, they're disappearing in all the wild places. And so what this means is that the elephants that we have under our care in managed or semi-managed captivity are pretty important. If we're going to keep having these animals on the face of this earth, we need to do better at looking after the elephants that we have. So we need to be thinking about the welfare of these animals, because that can have a huge impact, not only on their quality of life, but actually on how well they survive and how well they reproduce. So thinking about that, one important feature of that is thinking about their welfare. So what is welfare? Well, we can define it in terms of the 5 freedoms. This is obviously now a paradigm that's been used since it was released in 1979 by the Farm Animal Welfare Council. So these are the 5 freedoms. It was put out for farm animals: freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from discomfort, from pain, injury, or disease, freedom to express normal behavior, freedom from fear and distress. So these particular tenets were established initially for looking at farm animal welfare, but they've since been applied to pet animals, to horses, and even to exotic pet species and zoo animals. And what I want to kind of draw your attention to in particular is this one, the freedom to express normal behavior. Because this is actually really essential. And the question arises, well, how do we know if they're expressing normal behavior? Well, thinking about this from the context of elephants, obviously that's kind of the focus of a lot of my work when it comes to captive wildlife welfare. How do we encourage them to behave naturally? So if we want to try and figure out how to encourage natural behaviors, probably one of the first places to start looking is to think about how they live in the wild. How do they behave in the wild? Well, in the wild, the mother-calf unit, mom and baby, is kind of the most essential sort of core if we think about how they live. And then extending on from that, mother and calf live in these multi-generational herds. And so a female will stay in the herd that she was born into for her entire life. So that calf is surrounded by brothers, sisters, mom, aunties, cousins, grandma even. And they all live in this very large multi-generational herd. So if we think then about our elephants in captivity, well, how can we encourage them to have better relationships? Because we know this is a challenge. We have a lot of elephants in captivity where we see that actually they don't get along very well with the other elephants that they're living with. Well, how can we do better at that? Well, we did a study. We wanted to look at whether or not the kind of social interactions that elephants had were related to their genetic relatedness to the other elephants that they were living with. So does it make a difference if they're living with a family member or if they're living with somebody else who's not related to them? So we looked in 2 different zoos, and this picture of these elephants on the left here, well, that was kind of to give it a sense of elephants that are all related to each other. And this picture on the right, well, at this zoo, these were elephants that weren't related to each other. And then we looked at the kind of social interactions that they had. And there are kind of 2 ways that we describe or categorize social interactions. One is affiliative. These are these positive social behaviors, touching, comforting, playing. Or agonistic. These are the sort of more aggressive, less friendly behavioral interactions that you can have, like these bulls on the right that are fighting. So what we found, very much as we expected, was that for the elephants at the zoo where they were kind of all related to each other, we saw many, many, many more positive social interactions between those elephants than we saw at the zoo where they weren't related to each other. And at the zoo where they weren't so related to each other, they spend a lot more time fighting, engaged in agonistic behaviors, compared with the zoo where we had elephants that were related to each other. So, how do we encourage positive, natural social behaviors in our captive elephants? Well, probably kind of trying to emulate how they live in the wild, which is in these multi-generational family groups. And in fact, in the UK, this is something that they're increasingly moving towards in zoos. And indeed, it's something that's trying to be introduced in many different facilities across the globe, in the US, in mainland Europe as well. The difficulty being, of course, we've already got, unfortunately, a lot of unrelated elephants that are living in captive settings, and we still need to look after them. So there are some ongoing challenges with that. Another thing that we wanted to look at, because actually not that much work, surprisingly, not that much work had been done on it, is looking at resting behavior. How do we promote rest in our elephants? So resting behavior, and when I talk about it in this context, what I'm really referring to is sleep. So lying down, we call it lying rest. We know that sleep is important for good welfare. In any animal, it's important for us, it's important for dogs, it's important for elephants. They need to have enough sleep, and it's not just the time spent sleeping, but it has to be of a good quality. They have to have a nice deep sleep. And we know that if we or they don't get enough sleep, then they have poorer welfare. So we wanted to look at what kind of features are important for an elephant to have good lying rest, to have good sleep. And we looked at a couple of different factors. One of the things we looked at was what surface do they have to lie on? And so we looked at some zoos that had indoor enclosures, kind of like this surface on the left, concrete or hard tile. And we looked at some zoos that had softer surfaces like sand or even bark chips. And we wanted to see how does that affect their sleep. So thinking about an elephant, imagine it lying on a concrete surface. Now if we think about the kind of weight of that animal pressing down on that hard surface, well, we can kind of imagine what that's going to feel like for that elephant, as opposed to if we imagine that same elephant on the softer, sandy surface. Well, when we looked at sleep behavior and duration of sleep and frequency of sleep bouts, unsurprisingly, we found that they definitely prefer to lie down on a soft surface. And in fact, at one zoo where they only had hard surfaces indoors, those elephants didn't lie down to sleep at all. They would wait until they were let out into the yard and had some nice soft soil to lie down on. So that made a big difference, either sand or bark chips, but something soft. The other thing we thought was probably important was thinking about the fact that elephants are a highly social species. They really, really like to have contact with each other. And so they're often touching each other. They'll touch each other with their trunks, or they'll just kind of nudge or rub up against each other. They really like that physical contact. That's a big part of their interactions with each other. And so what we found was, interestingly, elephants would sleep better. They'd have more longer lying rest if they could touch another elephant when they were lying down. So what did we learn from this? How do we encourage lying rest in our zoo elephants? Give them a soft surface to lie down on. We like a softer surface too, so that's not a big surprise. And let them have contact with other elephants. That was really, really important to them. So here we can see that by looking at behavior in different environments, we can use that as a clue to tell us how we can manage elephants better, how we can give them better welfare. So, things to improve welfare. We've talked about some of those just now. But in order to know if we've improved welfare, we need to actually be able to measure it properly. So how do we measure elephant welfare? Well, if we're going to talk about measuring welfare, I think it's really important to first define what do we mean when we say welfare. So for our purposes, we would say that welfare includes both mental health and physical health, and that it involves interacting with the physical environment, so what's around them physically, things they can touch, their enclosure, stuff that they can play with, enrichment, trees, but also their social environment, because we think that's quite important for elephants. So who else is around? We think that welfare also really essentially must involve a sense of control or choice. That animal needs to have a sense of agency. I can choose what I'm doing, with whom I'm doing it, where I'm doing that. That element of choice is really, really important for good welfare. And the other thing that is quite important to consider is that welfare is very much about the individual. So we could have 5 elephants in a zoo, 10 elephants in a zoo. Each one of them may have quite different welfare, because welfare depends on, are you male or female? How old are you? Are you a little calf, or are you an adult? Might you want to be going out and finding others of your species? Are you older? Do you have arthritis? Do you have other health conditions that could be affecting you? What's your history? Were you born in captivity or born in the wild? All of these things can impact each elephant's welfare. And so when we think about measuring welfare, we can't measure it at the herd level, at the group level. It won't really give us enough fine detail about what each animal is experiencing, because it is very, very individual. So, thinking then about welfare assessment in our captive elephants in particular. So there are lots of different ways that you can measure different aspects of welfare. You can look at things like health or disease. You can look at different hormones that are associated with stress. But these kinds of measures can require specialist equipment, can require different training and expertise. It can be difficult to interpret, and it can be expensive to do these measurements. So behavior can be another way of assessing welfare, and it doesn't cost a lot. Behavior can give you some insight into what's going on in that animal's mind. What's their internal state? So this quote from this very, very famous animal behaviorist Joy Mensch said, careful observations of behavior can provide us with information about the animal's preferences and its dislikes and their internal states. So what do they like? What do they not like? What's going on inside? How do they feel about the environment that they're living in and their experience of it? So if we think about measuring welfare, what are some things that are really important that our measure needs to be able to do? Well, it needs to be able to detect different welfare states. So you should get different results for animals that are experiencing different welfare. It needs to be something that's reliable. It needs to be validated. So it needs to have rigorous scientific testing that shows that it's actually measuring what it says that it's measuring. That's really essential. We want to be able to have confidence that when we use this measurement, it's really doing what it says it is. So we developed a novel behavioral welfare assessment tool. So this tool that we created was something that was designed to be used by people who could observe behaviors and decide what an elephant's welfare was, or at least some part of, some aspect of the elephant's welfare, based on the behaviors that they observed. It was designed to be used by elephant keepers. These are people that are working with these animals every day, and they have the opportunity to observe them and really to assess their animals very quickly, and they can respond very quickly if they see that there's anything wrong. So the tool was designed to be fairly quick to use, not to take huge amounts of time, but also it was rigorously tested to be both reliable and valid. That was really important to us. And it was designed so that you could use it to monitor changes in that animal's welfare over time. So in a sense, each animal serves as their own baseline, their own yardstick that you're comparing against. So you want to see, how does that animal's welfare change if you change the enclosure, or if you change some other aspect of their lives, if you change how they're being trained, or you change what elephants are with them. So as I said, it was designed very much to be used by the people that are working with these elephants every day. So it was designed so that they could stand outside an enclosure, watch their elephant, and make an evaluation of their welfare.
An alternative way to measure the welfare of an animal
is behavior. So you can look at abnormal behaviors like bobbing, weaving, swaying in place, but also you can look at these positive behaviors like play behavior. So welfare isn't just about avoiding the negative. We do want to avoid the negative. We don't want to see lots of abnormal behaviors, lots of aggression. But we do also want to see positive welfare. We want to see that the animals have a good quality of life, that they're enjoying themselves. And so play behavior is one behavior we looked at. Feeding behavior. Feeding and foraging is really important. In our elephants, they spend 16 to 18 hours a day feeding and foraging in the wild. So we're hoping that we can see more of that kind of behavior and that level of expression of feeding in our captive elephants. And sleep behavior. Yeah, we mentioned it before. And obviously, this is a great photo that kind of really shows what these elephants are doing, because they're lying down and they're sleeping together on a nice soft surface. And this is what elephants prefer if they have a choice.
The Elephant Behavioral Welfare Assessment Tool, the EWP, has been used regularly by
So our tool was used by keepers since 2015. And we got some feedback from the keepers about their experiences using the tool and how they've used it. So they've said it forces you to observe your elephants more. And they actually, a number of keepers said, I don't usually have time to stop and watch my elephants, but this tool makes me do that, and that's actually quite good. And one keeper said, the more you use it, the more you understand behaviors and you understand your elephants better. It can make problems clear, but also we can use it to see improvements in our elephants. And another keeper said, I'm more confident in what to look for in our elephant's behavior. So, however, as great as the tool was, and we were getting feedback that they really liked it, the truth was it required them to print out bits of paper that they had to carry around with them across a few days, and then at the end of that time, they'd sit down and they would enter all of that data into a computer. It's time-consuming, but also there's more and more chances for error as they're trying to do carry around these bits of paper and then doing the data entry. So we wanted to create some way that would decrease the time involved, but also decrease the chances that there will be mistakes made. So we created an Android app of our tool. And so the app was designed so that you could literally have everything you need on a tablet. And you'd enter the data directly into the tablet, and the tablet would make your calculations for you. And then when you're back in Wi-Fi range, you can upload it to a database. And as soon as people upload it to that database, they get this report back. It's an automated report. And the report basically gives a summary of their elephant's data. And it gives it a summary of 10 of these composite scores that are created every time that they submit their data. And they could see that graphed. So each time that they submit an assessment, they'd get another set of data points on this graph. And so what they could do then is visually track how each of these different elements changes over time. And then quickly, they could visually see, have there been any changes? Has my elephant's welfare gone down in any way? And then looking and seeing, oh, what happened during that time point? Between here and here, what changed that might have affected that elephant's welfare? And the nighttime behavior, so for the overnight part of the tool, they note down whatever behaviors the elephant's engaged in. They have a list that they indicate which behavior they're engaged in. And then they get this little pie chart. And the pie chart basically tells them what percentage of the elephant's time they spend doing that behavior relative to the total number of observations that they make that night. So looking at things like feeding, lying rest, whether they're lying down with other elephants or lying down by themselves. If they're showing those abnormal repetitive behaviors like swaying or head bobbing, it's called a stereotypy. If they're engaged in feeding behavior, or if they're out of view of the camera. So this pie chart gave an idea of the different behaviors that they showed in one night. And then we also turned these into these stacked bar charts. So this is the same pie chart now for one night turned into a bar chart so that we could then have 3 nights or 4 nights or 5 nights of data that they could very easily and quickly compare with each other. They could see the relative amounts of these different behaviors that these elephants were showing. And then they can also go into an online portal. And when they log into that online portal, what they can also do is create some side-by-side comparisons. So they can look at different elephants at their facility. So side by side, this is the pie chart for this elephant, this is the pie chart for that one, and here's this elephant's stacked bar charts, and this is another elephant's stacked bar charts. And they can also compare themselves to all the other elephants that are in our database. And we're getting more and more people using our app, and so we're getting more and more data entered into our database. And so we're hoping over time that this is going to be a resource both that people with elephants can use to more easily monitor their welfare and inform their management, but that we can also use so we can provide better and better advice to places about the different things that affect elephant welfare, either that make it worse if they want to figure out why something might have gone down, or things that they can do to make their elephant's welfare better as we get more information from more and more people about the things that they're doing to look after their elephants. So all of this has been designed to hopefully make the welfare of these elephants better. And ultimately, we know that when animals have better welfare, they will live longer. And obviously, if these animals are living longer, and we know that animals with better welfare are more likely to reproduce and have calves. And that means it's going to help with species survival. It's going to help with the conservation of both African and Asian elephants, which will mean that hopefully we'll have them around on the planet for quite a bit longer. So I just want to say thank you to the keepers and staff at the UK zoos who have helped in supporting all of our research projects and trialing our tool, and all the students and volunteers that have helped with this work, members of our elephant welfare group, the behavior subgroup of that group, the digital research services team at the University of Nottingham, and the project has had funding from the University of Nottingham and also from the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. So you may have noticed we've got this lovely pull-up banner that we've created, and we've got some stuff over here, which is thank you gifts for people that donate to our project. But I wanted to just introduce you to the team for the Elephant Welfare Project. We now have a total of 17 undergraduate vet students that are helping with this work. And they've been engaged in various outreach activities, trying to spread the word about our work on social media. We've had in-person events, the SB Fest, and we've got, in fact, just coming up this weekend at the Charnwood Christmas Lights, the Christmas Market Festival on Sunday. So we're hoping to try and spread the news about our work. And we've got social media accounts on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, which I'm utterly ignorant on, but my students are all very well versed in, and they're helping to spread the word on those. And so we're asking people to visit our website and to visit our social media accounts and to like and to share. So for more information, you can see our project website, which is at elephantwelfareproject.org. And if you're interested, I've got some business cards for the project at the front, and they have the URL for our website and also a QR code if you just want to scan it into your phone. And there are links to our social media accounts from our website as well. You're very, very welcome to get in touch with us at ewp@nottingham.ac.uk. And thank you very much for your interest and any support you're able to give us.
Any questions?
Can your work, or has your work, been applied to other species?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. As a matter of fact, yes. So there's a fellow that was doing a master's study in Australia, and he literally used our work as a blueprint to do something similar for giraffe. And I've since been involved in a group of colleagues in the European Association for Aquatic Mammals who are developing something similar for dolphins. And so I've had the chance to get involved in some dolphin welfare research and developing a tool for dolphins as well, which is lovely. It's really amazing to see. Yeah.
I'm trying to get a handle on how big an issue is. How many zoos in the UK, for example, have elephants that are singletons or just as a pair, and how many have your ideal, grandmother-led family group of, say, 10, 12?
Well, family group of 10 or 12, Howlett's is the only facility I know in Kent, is the only facility I know that has quite that many. Whipsnade Zoo has a fair number, and Chester Zoo has a fair number. Dublin has a family, multi-generational family group. Singletons, well, Longleat kind of rescued Anne, that very, very sad ex-circus elephant. So I think kudos to them for taking her on, and they're doing the best they can for a gal that's had a really, really rough life. The only other place I know of probably would be, well, Paignton has a very old lady that they're just trying to look after as best they can. Part of the challenge is, once elephants kind of get past middle age, if they live that long, that we tend to find that they live quite long. So an elephant's lifespan in the wild can be 60 or 70 years. And we find that there are some elephants that are living that long. The trouble being that some of what we're then dealing with is kind of historical poor management or inappropriate management or less than ideal management that's happened years and years ago. And now we're just still trying to do the best we can for the elephants we've got. So there's a real challenge, and it's trying to find that balance, because we've got, the direction that we're trying to move towards, which is all our multi-generational family herds. And that's, I think, the ideal for any captive setting. But we've got the legacy of all these elephants that aren't that, and we have to give them somewhere to live and hopefully try and provide as good a welfare as we can for them in the setting that they're in. So one of the things that zoos in the UK now are particularly moving towards is trying to think about, are they going to manage just bulls in bachelor herds, which is how they tend to live once they go past puberty in the wild. So there is an all bachelor herd group now in the UK, or managing a reproductive age group, which is where you get your multi-generational family herd, or the older ladies that aren't really breeding, maybe not so compatible with other elephants, but they still need a nice place to stay also. And zoos are kind of figuring out how to do each of those things or one of those things, but it's going to be, I think, a long process of transition as we try and deal with the legacy that we have already remaining from historically not managing them in the greatest way. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it's a big problem, isn't it? I mean, you need a lot of space for the enclosure, and I mean, it can't be cheap, if you see what I mean.
Yes, absolutely. You're not wrong. I mean, well, we can't emulate the space they have in the wild where they have hundreds or even thousands of square miles that they roam over. But we're trying to figure out what aspect of that wild environment is most important, how much space is enough in a captive setting, but also kind of a lot of it also depends on what you have in there. So if you just have a giant open flat space, even if it's enormous, the elephants will probably huddle in a corner. They don't particularly, there's no incentive to move around. And so there needs to be lots of natural features. They like to swim, so there needs to be a pool deep enough for them to get into. They like knocking trees over, sadly, so it can be a lot of upkeep. You're not wrong. It's a very, very expensive thing to properly look after captive elephants. So it's not a small undertaking for any facility. And a number of zoos recently in the UK have decided to not have elephants anymore because they said, we don't feel like we can do the best job for our elephants. We would rather that they go somewhere that they can have better welfare.
Has that been a consequence of the app? Like, has anybody identified that?
I think probably that helped to encourage that decision or provided support for that decision to management, the kind of the evidence of the welfare of their elephants using our tool. The app was only just came out sort of in the last year and a half, but the tool, yeah, it's been out for a while now.
So are the genetics of all the family herds in the UK, are they all known? Like how?
Yes. Yeah, and I guess actually one of the things to mention is that the elephants in zoos here in the UK are not just managed as part of UK zoos, they're managed as part of the wider European population. And so a lot of the decisions that are made, if they are members of the European Association of Zoos and Aquariums, and most of them are. And so a lot of the decisions that are made about the elephants at a particular zoo are made more centrally because they're thinking about at a European level, which elephants do we need to make sure that are breeding and which ones do we need to make sure are more represented, which ones have had lots of offspring already so we don't need them to be breeding so much. And so it's quite a complicated Jenga trying to fit all the pieces together. And it's not just done at the UK level, it's done more broadly than that because we do need to be thinking about the whole population in a larger sense.
What are the options available to you? You know, if you've done all these things that you're talking about, like you've given them a nice place to lie down and a nice enclosure and all of that, if it's just not working and you still get elephants that they're not getting better and you can tell that they don't like feel good in themselves, what options do you have available to you? Is it like moving them around or?
It depends. We don't want to move them unnecessarily because actually there's a really important piece of work done looking at different risk factors for why elephants have shorter lives in zoos. And one of the biggest was how many times they've been moved. We know it's really, really stressful to them. I mean, if we have to, definitely, I think, yeah, it's kind of the last choice. But yes, sometimes that is needed. But some of it requires doing a little bit of sleuthing and trying to figure out like what might be going wrong. So I think it's really, as I mentioned, if we're thinking about what's going to encourage good welfare, what's going to make elephants happy, if you will, give them positive welfare, probably first thing that we should be looking to is how do they live in the wild, and how can we try and mirror that, copy that, emulate that in some way. So thinking about multi-generational family herds, having the opportunity for our bulls once they hit adolescence to be in social groups with other bulls, because historically they used to be kind of just isolated, because they tend to be much bigger than the females and tend to be sometimes more aggressive, quite substantially sometimes more aggressive. And so they're hard to contain in an enclosure, and so there's all kinds of health and safety issues, or just they're more expensive to look after. And it used to be that, not knowing necessarily any better, they would manage them by having them over by themselves. And now they're managing them in a social group, and I think that's much better welfare for that bull. But also, it's really quite important for younger elephants to be around older elephants, because a big part of how they learn about the environment and social behaviors is social learning from other elephants. And so it's really quite important for bulls to have other bulls around, and for our females, we know already, to be in the family herds. So we can look at things like, are they in a natural environment? What kind of physical resources do they have? Do they have a nice, soft, manipulable substrate? Do they have grass paddocks and soil? Do they have trees or stuff to push over? Do they have a nice, deep water area that's something that they can go into and submerge? Something with a shallow entry so that it's not too difficult for them to get into and out of. So we can think about those kinds of things that are really important to provide good welfare, those things that we know are important for good welfare. Some of it, unfortunately, like when we see the abnormal behaviors, the stereotypies, part of the challenge is we know that they first form when an animal needs to cope with a stressful situation. It's a way of coping. But the problem is that once they start expressing that behavior, what happens is at the level of the brain, when they express the stereotypy, they release this chemical in the brain, dopamine, and it makes them feel better. So every time they express that stereotypy, they release dopamine, they feel better. What happens after a while is that just becomes a habit. It becomes a self-reinforcing cycle. And the thing that was stressing them can go away. They might not be stressed anymore by that external thing, but now they're just in this habit of expressing this abnormal behavior because they feel better every time they do. And the problem is, once it gets to that stage, it's really, really hard to extinguish that behavior. So it can be difficult to know how to deal with that. And some people say, well, they're coping. It makes them feel better when they express it. We know that our stress hormones, if we want to call them that, the hormones that are associated with stress go down when they express the stereotypy. That's a good thing. So why is it a problem? The trouble is, when they're doing that, they're not engaged in other natural behaviors. They're not engaged in behaviors that we think could actually give them a positive quality of life. They're just coping. So, for example, we had one mom that had a young calf who did one of these stereotypies where she would just kind of move forward and back and move forward and back. And her calf came over and it wanted to nurse from her. And she actually kicked him out of the way so that she could keep doing the stereotypy. So the problem is that the elephant, any animal, when they're expressing a stereotypy, they're kind of looking inward, and they're not even responding to the environment around them anymore. And so it reduces their chances for more positive welfare. So I don't know if that was really a good answer to your question. The trouble is, it's a complicated question, really.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any differences between African and Asian elephants in captivity? Does the app, does it pick up differences in how they?
Yeah, there are differences between African and Asian elephants in general, actually even in the wild. There are differences. And it's something that people don't realize because they look really, really similar, the African and the Asian elephants, but they're actually a different genus as well as a different species. And actually, the Asian elephant is more closely related phylogenetically to the woolly mammoth than they are to the African elephant, which is quite astounding when you think about it. But, I mean, obviously, they're quite similar physically, and they are very, very intelligent, Africans and Asians, and very strong social bonds. But actually, it's interesting because the Asian elephant seems to, and we don't have as much data on them, they're a lot harder to study because the Asian elephants tend to live in dense jungles, tropical jungles, and it's really, really hard to see them. We had a bit of a cheat with the African elephant in the savannas, because you could be quite some distance away from them and you could sit back in a vehicle and watch them without interfering with them. But with the Asian elephants, it's really tricky. You can't sit back to watch them because they're in amongst all these trees. And actually, they're surprisingly stealthy animals. You can be just around the corner from an elephant and not realize that they're there until you come around the corner and there they are. So they're a lot harder to study in the wild, but I do know a lady who's been studying elephants in Sri Lanka. She's got the longest running observations of elephants in the wild and their behavior. And what she's uncovering is that they're similar but slightly different. They seem to have, tend to have slightly smaller family herds, and that elephants in general, in the wild, engage in what we call fission-fusion society. So they'll split apart, fission, and then they'll come back together again, fusion. And they do that quite a lot. And the groups, when they split apart, there's sort of the core group, like I mentioned, mother calf, maybe another small herd. And then they can come together in these larger and larger and larger aggregations. So you get to these clan groups of, you can get up to 100 elephants or more all together, really excited seeing each other. But you don't see quite such large family groups in the Asians. And it's interesting, one of my colleagues was studying play behavior in African elephants and Asian elephants. And one of the things that really, she hadn't quite clocked and really quite astonished her, she started by watching the Asians, and then she went and she watched the Africans. And she said, the African elephants are so joyful. They're really exuberant, and they really express them. They're very emotional. And the Asian elephants are a little bit more reserved and a little more shy, and they're not quite as outgoing in expressing their emotion. So there are definitely some differences that we see just between the two different genera of elephants. And in terms of differences in captivity, well, it's hard to say. It's
more of one or the other.
So in terms of absolute numbers, there tends to be a bias towards Asian elephants. There's sort of a bit of a mythos that they're easier to look after. And actually, I've worked with facilities in Africa that work with captive elephants and use them for tourist rides, and I would say probably they're as trainable, they can be as tractable as Asian elephants. But that's just kind of the way that things seem to have shaken out in the zoo world. But there's, yeah, a fair few across Europe and across the US. I mean, we've only got now about 50 odd in the UK, spread across different facilities. But, oh gosh, there was a study in the US recently working with the US zoos, and just in that study alone, there were 273 elephants, so they have a much larger population to work with.
Any other questions?
Is the app sort of something you intend to develop with more sort of monitorable features over time as you collect more data about the elephants from it, or is it sort of like
Yes.
an end product?
Yeah, no, the app is very much evolving. And actually, so we work as part of the Elephant Welfare Group, which is this UK government advisory group. And I head up the behaviour subgroup, but there's other folks doing health. So looking at foot health, looking at nail cracks and foot sores, but also looking at body condition, looking at whether they're limping, so looking at the gait, locomotion analysis. And so over time, and hopefully if we can raise the funds, then we'll be able to add to our app. I guess one thing to mention about the app and the work that we're doing and the facility that the zoos have for logging into the online portal, all of that we've put together and are providing free of charge to anybody working with elephants. Because it was really, really important to me that cost not be a barrier to people adopting this. So I'm working with zoos in Eastern Europe and across Southeast Asia. I'm working with tourist facilities in Myanmar and Indonesia and Vietnam and Thailand and Zimbabwe, and they wouldn't have the money to pay for an app. And, well, I thought it was probably, it'd be too difficult to figure out who do I charge, who do I not charge. And I thought much fairer to just say, I'm not going to charge anybody. But the problem is, as you can probably appreciate, there are ongoing costs associated with the work. And so we're trying to meet these costs just using public fundraising. And so if I can ask your help to get the word out and encourage people to learn about our project and hopefully encourage people to donate to the project, that would be amazing. So we've got an active fundraising project. You'll see I brought with me some of the thank you gifts that we have for people that donate to the project. We've got some canvas bags and some pens and enamel badges and things. But really, if you can just learn about the project and spread the word, that would be amazing. We'd really appreciate it. Are there any other questions at all?
I
Yeah.
have just a question about. Oh, yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah, I'm just thinking, are there any other universities involved apart from Nottingham? Because I assume it's like if there are more universities involved, it would cover a wider area of the UK or even the world.
Yeah, no, we don't at the moment have more universities involved directly in the sense of helping us with some of our outreach and stuff. But that said, I have quite a few folks that contact me from various universities, undergraduates and postgraduate students who are really interested in the project, who might want to do research or just help with the project. And yeah, absolutely welcome anybody to be involved in the project and help promote it.
I just have a question about the standardization. So how do you train the keepers? And, are the questions very black and white, or are they, do they have a scale of 1 to 5? And how do you standardize what the response is, and what happens if a keeper changes?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And actually, the whole idea of standardizing are the scores for one elephant at one zoo. How do you get them comparable to another elephant at a different zoo? And the quick answer is you don't. And we designed the tool so it doesn't really matter, because each animal serves as their own comparator. And that way we don't have to try and figure out how to standardize, because I think it would be a really, really difficult thing to do, to be quite honest. And so we developed and validated the tool so that it doesn't require that, because the whole point of the tool isn't to assign an absolute value for the welfare of an animal at a facility. It's very much about seeing changes over time and what causes those changes, what causes an animal to have better welfare, but also what causes it to have poorer welfare, because that can help that facility to figure out what's going on with their animals and to make positive changes, but it also helps us to give better advice to lots of different facilities that we work with who say to us, well, how do we improve our elephant scores? How do we improve their welfare? And as we get more and more data into our database, and we get more and more evidence that, whenever a zoo does this, it improves these scores, or whenever this has happened, it tends to decrease them. It helps us to have more evidence-based.
But do you give the keepers training
to use the app? Yeah, so we do. I have a YouTube video that does kind of step-by-step instructions, but also I've been giving a lot of online workshops over the past year and have a lot more scheduled, and hope to be going out and doing some in-person workshops as well with folks.
Any other questions? No? So just thank Lisa again.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your attention.